Hi there. Welcome to Pallet University. So today is March 6th, which means today is the reveal of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX. And you might be thinking, what is the most optimal starter choice? Which starter and partner are the best to go through the game? And I'm here to answer that question for you. Obviously, there's a test in the game to see which Pokemon you are for a reason. If you want to go by that test and just pick whichever starter it gives you by default, absolutely do that. That's how I personally will be playing the game. But I know some people like to choose like maybe the most optimal, or maybe they get stuck with a starter given to them that they don't know necessarily is not very good. So this is just kind of some information about which starters will be the best versus the worst. So I'll be throwing up graphics with what all of the starters' abilities as well as their starting movesets, because unlike the original Mystery Dungeon games, you don't just start with, Scratch and Tackle, or Tackle and Tail Whip, or whatever the Pokemon actually starts with. You get lots of egg moves, and in some case, level up moves, which is pretty interesting. So let's go through just to see which Pokemon have what moves. So I just want to start off by saying every starter has a move with at least one move with a range of 2. So every starter has a ranged move. I just want to start with that. So Bulbasaur has Vine Whip, which is the ranged move. It hits 2 tiles away. Sludge, Tackle, and Seed Bomb. All of the normal starter Pokemon have their normal abilities, so Overgrow, Blaze, and Torrent, by the way. Charmander has Dragon Rage, Flame Burst, Bite, and Scratch. Flame Burst is the ranged move that hits up to 4 tiles away, and then Dragon Rage is interesting. Dragon Rage is good very early because it does a set 30 points of damage, and then it becomes a ranged move as you level up. The range increases at levels 30 and 80. It sounds like I don't know how much it goes up by, the range. So it could go up by 2 when you get to level 30, and then by another 2 when you get to 80, but I don't know that for sure. I would assume that it's only 1. So early game, Dragon Rage is very, very good because not much. That Dragon Rage having a base power of 30 or a base damage of 30 will at least 2-shot most things for the first couple of dungeons. So Charmander's a very solid pick early on. Next up we have Squirtle. Squirtle has Brick Break, Water Gun, which is the ranged move that hits 2 tiles away like Vine Whip, Bite, and Tackle. It quickly learns Bubble, which is a ranged move with a range of 4, which is really good because the more range you can get, generally the better. Pikachu. Pikachu has Static as its ability, unfortunately, and it does not have Lightning Rod. But Pikachu starts with Electro Ball, Iron Tail, Grass Knot, and Fake Out. Not the best moveset, but Electric and Grass together tend to do pretty well. That's pretty good coverage in general. Meowth has the ability Pick Up, which in this game just gives you like a random chance to get a held item if you don't have Meowth holding one every time you go to a new floor. I don't know. I'm sure that it works similarly to the games, whereas the higher level you are, the better chance you get to get better items, but I don't know that for sure. But anyway, Meowth's moveset is Scratch, Fake Out, Bite, and Foul Play. Meowth's got probably one of the worst movesets just because it doesn't have almost any coverage. Granted, normal and dark do tend to go pretty well together. However, having only 2 options is generally not good because every other Pokemon has more than that. And I forgot to say this with Pikachu, but Fake Out is the range move that has a range of 2. Psyduck is kind of an unexpected starter option that I always forget about in the original Mystery Dungeon games. But Psyduck has the ability Cloud 9, which is very useful because throughout the game you get various weather thrown at you, and especially some of the harder dungeons. And Cloud9 just completely gets rid of it. It always makes the weather clear, which is really good, especially for some of the later dungeons. But Psyduck's moves are Scratch, Water Gun, which, like with Squirtle, is the ranged move, Confusion, and Zen Headbutt. Like I said with Meowth, its coverage isn't great, and even with TMs, Psyduck doesn't have the best coverage to begin with anyway. But Cloud9 is a really, really solid ability to have for it that kind of makes up for that. Another kind of forgotten starter choice is Machop. Machop has the ability Guts, which is good and bad. Good in that it's Obviously Guts is a really good ability. Machop is a physical attacker, and it increases your attack when you have a status ailment, which are somewhat common in the Mystery Dungeon franchise. However, when you go to a new floor, your status ailment is healed. So it means that you can't really use that to get a boost, throughout the entire dungeon. And even status ailments like paralysis. Paralysis goes away after, I think, a handful of turns. So that doesn't even last the entire floor. The only ones that do are poison, bad poison, and burn. So Guts is useful, but not as useful as you might think it is. Anyway, Machop has Bullet Punch for its range move, which hits 2 tiles away, Brick Break, Karate Chop, and Strength. Having 2 stab moves I think is a little pointless, in my opinion. But also Machop doesn't get a lot of coverage egg moves anyway. So I don't think they had a lot of options to give it. And then even between Steel and Fighting, they don't have the best coverage range. But Machop is nonetheless a pretty solid option just because later in the game... actually, no. Machop's not very good. Don't pick Machop. Next up, we have Cubone, and Cubone's ability is Lightning Rod. You might think that this is kind of minus. Actually, that is kind of a detriment to Cubone, but as we'll talk about later, it's actually very, very good. But you might think it's not very good because Cubone's immune to electric anyway. It's a ground type. But as we'll talk about later, it's actually extremely helpful and probably one of the best ability out of any of the starters. Cubone's moveset is Headbutt, Brutal Swing, which is the ranged move, and we'll talk more about Brutal Swing later. Bone Club and Brick Break, which is altogether really good coverage. It's got 4 different move types, and 4 of them, all 4 moves are generally pretty good. Lastly, for Gen 1 Pokemon, pretty much more than half of the starter options in this game are Gen 1 Pokemon. But lastly for the Gen 1 Pokemon is Eevee. Eevee has the adaptability ability, which is really, really good. Because its starting moveset is Bite, Tackle, Swift, and Quick Attack. Quick Attack is the range move. So it basically buffs Tackle, Swift, and Quick Attack. And for the most part, you'll only be using Quick Attack and Tackle, at least for your stab moves. You'll probably want to end up keeping Quick Attack on until you end up evolving in the post game, just because range plus adaptability boost is going to be very, very powerful for you. And while Eevee's range is not, or Eevee's move pool is not excellent, there are a lot of TMs, and you can get TMs relatively early in this game compared to a lot of other Mystery Dungeon games. And especially compared to a lot of main series games, you can get a lot of really good TMs pretty early. So Eevee is a pretty solid option just because it is surprisingly powerful with adaptability. Next up we have Chikorita, and Chikorita's moveset is Razor Leaf, which is the range move. It has a range of 4. Ancient Power, Tackle, and Grass Knot. Similarly to I've said with a couple others, having 2 moves of the same type, even if they are stab, is generally not all that great for coverage, especially when you look at some of the other starter options and they have 4 separate moves that are all generally pretty good. Chikorita does have Ancient Power, which can be kind of fun. I think it's the only one that starts with a rock type move, which is which can be pretty useful throughout the game. Plus, obviously, Ancient Power has the chance to boost every one of your stats. And I believe Ancient Power has at least more PP than it does in the normal game. I believe it only has 5 in the base games, and I think it has somewhere between 8 and 15 PP in these games, which means that it's relatively spammable, so you can kind of fish for those boosts, especially in boss fights. After Chikorita, we have Cyndaquil, who has Ember, which is a ranged move, has a range of 2. Quick Attack, which also has a ranged move, Double Kick, and Facade. So having 2 ranged moves is really, really good because it allows you to have different options. Obviously you want to hit things before they actually get to you, which is why ranged moves are really powerful in these games. But you want, instead of... It's better to have one of a ranged move of 4 and a ranged move of 2 because it saves on PP for both of them. Whereas you'll almost always be using Ember over Quick Attack unless it's something that resists Ember. But generally, Cyndaquil's got an okay moveset. Having Fighting type coverage is pretty good. However, having Facade is not very useful because it's a Fire type, so it can't be burned. Paralysis, like I mentioned, only lasts for a couple of turns. And while you're paralyzed, you can't even use attacks. So you don't really get the Facade boost from that. So you only get the Facade boost from Poison and Bad Poison, which are generally, you want to get rid of those as soon as possible because they keep you from recovering health. So generally Facade isn't very good, especially when it's on a Fire type. Last for Gen 2, we have Totodile, who has Metal Claw, Water Gun with a range of 2, Ice Fang, and Scratch. Ice coverage is really good. It's the only starter that gets Ice type coverage, which is really, really good. You'll likely keep Ice Fang for the entire game because it's rather powerful, and as I'll talk about later, a lot of the bosses throughout the game, I think almost all of them, except for the first one, are actually weak to ice. So obviously having Ice Fang is super, super good. So Totodile is a pretty solid option overall. Next up we have Trico, who is arguably the most versatile starter, at least like at the beginning of the game, because it has Quick Attack, which has a range of 2, Absorb, Dragon Breath, which has a range of 4, and Iron Tail. It is the only starter besides Charmander that has a move with a range of 4, which is obviously super helpful. Like I mentioned, you want to have 2 ranged moves, one to hit farther away and then one to hit ones that are closer to you, so you can save PP for both of those moves, which Trico has between Dragon Breath and Quick Attack. Plus it also gets extra coverage with Iron Tail, which is really good. And it also gets pretty solid stab and absorb. Because, it heals you, and Absorb's not as weak, relatively, in these games as it is in the main series games. So Absorb is going to be a really solid option for you. So Trico's probably early game, probably one of the best options you can pick. Next we have Torchic, who starts with Quick Attack, Ember, Low Kick, and Peck. Similarly to what I said about Cyndaquil, having both Ember and Quick Attack isn't all that helpful. But its other 2 coverage options are pretty interesting. Low Kick is obviously pretty solid. Same thing like I mentioned with Cyndaquil, how fighting coverage is pretty good. Peck doesn't really do a ton for it though, because, the only thing to my knowledge that Peck is super effective on that Ember isn't is fighting. So you'll almost always be clicking Ember anyway. So Peck is sort of useful, but not really. It's pretty much in the same kind of boat as Cyndaquil. It's just moveset isn't great, but we'll talk about later how it is actually better than Cyndaquil. Second to last, we have Mudkip, who starts with Water Gun, which is the ranged move, Mud Slap, Mud Bomb, and Tackle. Unfortunately, I don't know why they didn't give it Ice Ball, which is surprisingly very, very powerful in these games, and I know for a fact that Mudkip gets Ice Ball as an egg move. Instead, they gave it Tackle, and generally, if a Pokemon in this game, when they have all these options, starts with Tackle, it's probably not the most useful, like Tackle or Scratch or whatever they usually start with at like level 5. Between Water and Ground, it's pretty okay coverage, but not the best. And again, where it's with like Chikorita, how I said it, how it has 2 moves that are the same type, it had 2 grass type moves, that's not great, but at least you get stab on both of those, because in Mystery Dungeon games, same type attack bonus is still a thing. However, Mudkip has 2 ground type moves, and it's not a ground type, so not the best, but it also gets some solid TMs for later in the game, so not the best option, but also not the worst. Lastly, we have Skitty, who is surprisingly really, really good. So Skitty gets Cute Charm, which is very important, which I'll talk about later. So Skitty, like I said, gets Cute Charm ability, and its moves are Fake Out, Echoed Voice, Charge Beam, and Grass Knot. It does get a little sort of deduction almost because it does have 2 of the same moves. However, they're both stab, and they both do really different things. Fake Out is specifically for range, because I don't believe Charge Knot is a range move, or Charge Beam is a range move, but I don't know that for sure. And Echoed Voice is extremely powerful, because the second time you use it and every other time after that, it is 1.5 times boosted, which is super, super strong, especially if you already have like a Charge Beam +1 setup. Skitty can actually be really, really good. And like I mentioned with Pikachu, electric and grass coverage together is pretty solid. Okay, so those are all of the starter options sort of out of the way. But what is the best sort of pair combination? In my opinion, the best pair combination is Squirtle, Cubone. Which one's which doesn't really matter. But let's talk about why those 2 in particular. So Squirtle is really, really good, like I mentioned, because it gets good ranged moves, like I mentioned, very, early on, it gets Bubble, which is very, very good. I remember the first time I played the regular Mystery Dungeon games, I kept Bubble with me the entire game. And even, like, while I was a Blastoise. I think my final moveset as a Blastoise was Bubble, Hydro Pump, Hydro Cannon, and Ice Beam. Because ranged moves are just that good. And while they kind of nerfed ranged moves because they used to have a range of 10, and now some have a range of 10, most got nerfed back to 4. But if it's a powerful enough move, you don't really need a range of 10 to make them effective. A range of 4 is more than enough. It gets really solid coverage moves. And like I said, TMs are become available very, very early in the game. And defensively, it's really solid. It's especially once you get toward the late game, it's not very frail. Water type in general is pretty good because it's only got 2 weaknesses. So it's just a very solid option defensively as well as offensively because, like I said, between the range and a reasonable amount of coverage, it's all around really, really solid. But where this pairing really gets better is with Cubone. Cubone is really good, especially early game, because of Brutal Swing. And I said we were going to talk about it later, and here it is. So Brutal Swing, from what I understand, it has a range of 2, but all around Cubone. So you could potentially hit 8 other Pokemon. I think that's how it works. I haven't fully tested that yet. I think the real test will be the first time you run into a monster house. Whether that's really what Brutal Swing does, but reading the description of Brutal Swing, that's the way it made it sound, was that it hits all around Cubone and has a range of 2. Plus, Dark-type moves in general are really good because there's not that many things that resist Dark-type. It's pretty much just Dark Fighting and Fairy, I believe. There's not that many Fairy types. There's not a lot of, especially early, there's not a lot of Fighting types or really Dark types. So especially early game, Brutal Swing is really, really good. Cubone has a surprisingly really deep move pool as well. So in the Mystery Dungeon games, most Pokemon are fairly well-rounded. Cubone, and even Cubone itself, I think its special attack is only a little bit less than its attack. And Cubone's special coverage is actually really, really good. It gets Ice Beam, it gets like Flamethrower and Fire Blast, which are both, Ice Beam and Flamethrower are really good range moves. It gets Rock-type moves, and between Ground, Fire, Rock, and Ice, that is incredible coverage. It also gets access to Bone Meringue, which is one of the moves that still has a range of 10. It's not very accurate, but it does hit twice. And if you have a range of 10 on it, you can really you can demolish Pokemon from a long, long ways away. And the fact that you get Stab on it is incredible. So like a moveset of Bone Meringue, Flamethrower, Ice Beam, and a Rock move. I don't think any of the Rock moves have range, but I don't know that for sure. But with that moveset, you will pretty much very easily wipe any dungeon that you go through. But the last piece that makes Cubone probably the best overall would be Lightning Rod. So Lightning Rod draws in Electric-type moves, if the mechanic still works the way I think it does, from the entire floor. So even if you and your partner get separated, if a wild Pokemon or an enemy Pokemon tries to use an Electric-type move against your partner, it will go to you instead. I know it definitely works that way if you're in the same room in the dungeon, but even I think if you're on the same floor, that works super well as well. Which one of the early bosses is an Electric-type. Which makes it very hard if you have, say Squirtle is your starter, and then you choose, say, Charmander as your partner. You're gonna get bodied. You're gonna get absolutely destroyed by that Pokemon. So having Cubone is just incredible support, as well as really great offensive presence with great range moves, pretty powerful attacks, and very good coverage. So I do have 2 sort of honorable mention pairings that are not quite the best, but will still do super well. The first being Psyduck Cubone. The only reason for Psyduck not being better than Squirtle is that it doesn't have the range that Squirtle does, and its move pool is not as good. That's pretty much it, but the reason why it's still an honorable mention is because of Cloud 9. In later dungeons, weather can really mess you up. So having Cloud9 on Psyduck is super, super helpful. And then Cubone for all the same reasons that I listed above. The second honorable mention is Trico Charmander, mostly because they have really good range options, both of them, pretty much from the start. And then just general synergy. Grass, fire tend to work pretty well together. As we'll talk about later, grass types in general are not good. Not good in this game, but I'll talk about that in more detail later. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the best and worst overall individual picks, regardless of who the partner is. So if you pick one of these Pokemon in the top 4, I have 4 best overall Pokemon. If you pick one of them, they'll be pretty solid, regardless of who your other Pokemon is. Just know that Pokemon's probably going to be carrying the team, so you probably want that to be you instead of your partner. Number 1 best overall, like I've kind of mentioned a couple times, is Cubone. I'm not going to talk, a huge amount more about it. The only downside is that its stats are kind of mediocre. But seeing as you don't get to evolve until the post game anyway, most of these Pokemon stats are pretty mediocre. But Cubone's coverage, its support ability, and its range just make it really, really, really solid. The number 2 best overall, and I cannot believe that I'm saying this, is Skitty. Yeah, Skitty. So when I first saw that Skitty was an option again, I kind of rolled my eyes and got kind of mad because I was like, Skitty's going to be so bad. But as it turns out, Skitty's actually really, really good. So the reason that Skitty was, in my mind, going to be really bad is that the last time Skitty was a starter option was in the Explorers of Time, Dungeon, and Sky Mystery Dungeon games. And back then, the Pokemon had access to both of its 2 main abilities. So Skitty's 2 abilities are Cute Charm and Normalize. And so if Pokemon had 2 abilities, both of them were active all the time. So Skitty always had Normalize, which is useful for one reason, and that's being able to use electric type moves such as Thunderbolt on ground types, more specifically like Thunder Wave on ground types in competitive. That's the only reason to ever use Normalize. But in this game, like I mentioned, Skitty has Cute Charm instead. And with that, it gets really solid coverage moves for TMs. It gets Thunder and Thunderbolt. It gets Shadow Ball. Its special attack is not great, but between Charge Beam, being able to boost its special attack, Echoed Voice is very, very powerful. Like I mentioned, the first time you use it, it's not that powerful, but if you use it multiple times, basically from the second time on, it gets a 50% buff, which in the Mystery Dungeon games is actually really, really important. So during boss fights, that can be so important, that extra damage. It gets Fairy type moves, which is not common at all in these games. I'm assuming that I'm basing this mostly off of the most recent game that this Pokemon has appeared in. So Skitty, I don't believe is in Sword and Shield. Skitty is kind of so irrelevant that I haven't actually paid attention to if it is or not, but I don't think it is. So I'm just going off its Gen 7 moveset. And it gets some Fairy type moves, not stuff like Moonblast, but I believe it gets Dazzling Gleam. I believe it gets Fairy Wind, maybe Player Off is. I'm pretty sure it gets Player Off. And it also gets Sing, which Sleep is a really good status condition to use during boss fights. So overall, just between its really great coverage, Echoed Voice, having access to Fairy type moves, which is not very common, and being able to put things to sleep, Skitty's a really surprisingly really good option. Number 3 is Torchic, and I know I kind of roasted Torchic a little bit and said that it's not the most optimal, and that's definitely true for the main game. It gets okay starting moves. Getting 2 range moves is better than only having 1. So it does have some solid starting moves. It has a solid, coverage options between fire, fighting with low kick, and then it also gets Rock Slide. So if you can manage to get that TM relatively early, which is basically just up to RNG, whether the shop in town has Rock Slide available when you happen to have money for it. But between firefighting and rock, that's really great coverage. Plus, this is sort of a post-game thing, but Mega Evolution is a thing in these games. And Mega Blaziken is arguably, I don't even think it's arguable. I think Mega Blaziken is the best Mega Evolution of all of these starters, at least like of it available in these games. So it's just very, very solid for the post-game, and passable for the main story. The fourth is kind of a question mark because I'm not sure exactly how good it'll be, but I think it could potentially be really good, which is Eevee. Mostly because of adaptability. It gets, solid. I wish there was a better ranged move than Quick Attack, but, one is better than nothing. So Quick Attack will be pretty powerful because of adaptability, as well as I'm sure you'll get a better attacking move than Tackle. It gets okay coverage with things like Shadow Ball. I believe it gets Dig, which is pretty good. But the biggest thing is post-game options. You can, if these games are set up in the same way that the original one was, you'll be able to evolve almost immediately after you beat the game, assuming you have the right items, which for Eevee can be a little tricky because you need the evolution stones to do it. So depending on how quickly you can get those, which they were somewhat farmable in the original game, so I expect they could be as well here. You should be able to just have a lot of options for how you want to structure your team post-game. So wrapping up this video, we have the worst of these starter options. And these are in no particular order, and you'll see why in just a second. But we're going to start with Meowth. Meowth is really just not good. Like, most of the official starter Pokemon have not great stats, but Meowth has really bad stats. The only thing that saves Meowth at all in the regular game is its speed, and speed really doesn't come in to, isn't that much of a factor in Mystery Dungeon games. Its coverage options are not very good, especially considering it's what moves it starts with. It could have started with Iron Tail, but instead it started with 2 normal type moves and 2 dark type moves, one of which being Foul Play, which will not be even remotely useful until later in the game. Bite is, for almost every circumstance, a much better move. So, also its ability is really quite bad. Meowth has access to Technician, which would be a really solid move, a really solid ability if it had that instead of Pickup, but Pickup is just, it's alright, but it's very inconsistent, and you can't ever control how it's used, It's not like you could, it's not like Torrent, Overgrow, or Blaze where you could purposefully let yourself get a little low to do extra damage. Pickup's just completely random. It's a completely passive ability, which is also not great for Mystery Dungeon games. And then lastly, its Stab is just really bad. The best normal type move that I believe it gets is Slash, which, cool. It's a high crit move, but that's about it. It's still, at the end of the day, base 70. It does, I will give it, credit. It does have access to Play Rough later in the game. Let me make sure that's correct. Yes, it should get access to Play Rough, but that's not until level 44, which ideally you will have evolved it by then. Because you probably won't be to the 40s, especially mid 40s, by the end of the main story of the game. And then after you evolve it into Persian, it'll go from being learned at level 44 to being learned at somewhere in the 50s, which will be even further into the late game, making it a lot less useful. So overall, Meowth's just not good. Don't pick Meowth. And lastly, we have just a general statement, which is grass types. Grass types are not very good, and it's nothing to do with themselves in general. But just sort of how the game is set up. So I don't want to spoil anything, but it looks like there's going to be more bosses than the original game, which I like. However, there are 7 main story bosses, right? Or boss fights. 6 out of those 7 resist grass. And I think 5 of those 7 are flying types. So they will have super effective stab against you, which when you're going up against, for the most part, legendary Pokemon, you're going to get at least 2 shot, if not 1 shot, by those super effective stab moves. some of them are even 4 times grass resists, which is less of a problem for Bulbasaur because as a secondary stab, but it's just generally not very good to pick these grass types. And the one of the 7 that doesn't resist grass is in a dungeon full of fire types. So you're probably going to wipe out at least once on your way there. And also grass types in general just kind of have poor coverage. They do pretty well with Trico's coverage. Like the moveset that you start out with Trico is probably going to be the one you keep for the entire game, with the exception of maybe eventually switching Absorb for Mega Drain or Giga Drain, and maybe something else for Quick Attack, but you're probably going to keep Dragon Breath and probably Iron Tail for the entire game. Whereas Chikorita, you'll probably keep Razor Leaf and Ancient Power, and then Bulbasaur is like, I don't even know with Bulbasaur. Eventually it'll get Razor Leaf, which is better than Vine Whip. But in general, grass types are just, through no fault of their own, are just at a really severe disadvantage. Basically, the entire game is what it's like going through Gyms 1 and 2 in Kanto with Charmander. You're going up against Pokemon that you're weak to and that resist your stab. And you just have to really heavily rely on your teammate. And there's really not a teammate that is good against all of those other Pokemon, against all those bosses. So it'll make boss fights in particular very, very challenging for you. So that's pretty much going to wrap it up. And I know that I talked a lot in this video. This video has been relatively long. But at the end of the day, choose whoever you want. If for you, that's whoever the personality quiz says you should, and then your favorite Pokemon of who's left, that's absolutely fine. You know, these games are not particularly hard. There are certain spots that are absolutely going to challenge you if your team is not, equipped for it. But you can pretty easily, especially if you're familiar with the Mystery Dungeon franchise, go through these games without waiting out at all. This is just sort of a guide to let you know sort of which Pokemon are optimal and which Pokemon are suboptimal. I know I'm going to be going with, personally, whatever Pokemon the quiz says that I should. Typically, for me, it's usually Charmander, Squirtle, or occasionally Machop. And then for my partner, I'm almost positive I'm going to pick Cubone, just because those Pokemon were not an option the original time. The only Pokemon that could be your partner were Pokemon that were not the same type as you. Any of the normal starters, so like say you got Psyduck as your main Pokemon, you couldn't pick any of the water type starters. So your options were the fire type starters, the grass type starters, or Pikachu. You couldn't pick Cubone, Machop, Meowth, Eevee, whatever. But in this game they are. So I'm going to go with Cubone just because it's an extra option that we didn't have last time. So let me know down below whether you think this sort of guide is nonsense. Let me know which Pokemon you're going to be choosing, or if you have already taken the quiz and you're going to be continuing from the demo, let me know what Pokemon you started out as, what Pokemon the quiz says that you are, because I think it's always fun to know what the quiz says, because for me it's usually fairly accurate. Some people's kind of hit or miss, but at the end of the day, I love these games. This is a remake of my favorite video game of all time, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team. So I could not be happier that this game came out when it did. I'm going to be doing a Let's Play of it. Episode 1 of it should be up today, and I should be doing ideally daily uploads until we finish that Let's Play, so keep an eye out for that. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at Pallet_U to keep up on all things Pokemon science, and as always, there's a time and place for everything.